This is it guys, our full comprehensive review of the most hyped up car in Malaysia since, well, ever, the new Proton X50. So can it actually live up to all that hype? Well, the short answer is no. If you are one of those people who expect it to be absolutely perfect or at least near perfect, well, I'm sorry to disappoint, it's not. The reality is the X50 has quite a few minor issues and flaws that hold it back, which we will cover in detail in this video. The question is it at least good enough to be a recommended buy, or should you just go ahead and cancel your order? And what about myself? Now that I've driven it properly on Malaysian roads, do I regret placing a booking for it for myself? Well, answers to all that and more in this video. First of all, I would like to personally apologize for being late with this review. It was my decision to hold off all car reviews on paulsan.org during the CMCO, as I felt that us driving through the travel restrictions goes against the spirit of the CMCO. Now that travel restrictions have all been lifted, we can go back to reviewing cars again. Secondly, here's a fair warning that this review is going to be a little bit different to our regular videos. This being a Proton, naturally the public's eye is going to be on it like a hawk, wanting to know every detail, every single fault. So yes, we are going to be extra critical of it. If you've been following this channel long enough, you'll know that we did the exact same thing when the current Proton Myvi launched 3 years ago. That review, by the way, has garnered over 2.7 million views so far over 3 languages. So thank you again, Malaysians, for all that support. Whew, wow, that was 3 years ago. Time goes by fast. Except for 2020, this year sucks. The Proton X50 range starts from 79,000 ringgit for the standard model, going up to 103,000 ringgit for this flagship variant. I've already done a detailed video breaking down the differences between the 4 variants, so do check that out if you want to know what each version offers. Personally, I think the standard variant is very well priced, but I don't think you should buy it because it only has 4 airbags. To me, it's absolutely unacceptable for any car maker to take airbags out from brand new 2020 cars. Malaysian car buyers deserve better than that. The executive, premium and flagship variants, to be frank, I thought that Proton should have priced them a little bit lower, especially with this year's SST exemptions. The flagship variant here, for instance, I thought should have dipped under the 100,000 ringgit mark. But pricing aside, I think Proton has done a very good job in differentiating the 4 variants. The cheaper variants don't look like bargain basement models, they still look very good, unlike other cheaper models out there. Also, I think there's a bit too big of a gap between the premium and flagship variants. I think bundling in all the active safety stuff, the black roof with the sunroof, that's completely fine, but putting together the more advanced TGDI engine exclusive to the flagship is a bit too much for me. I think the premium should also get the more advanced engine. But having said that, the new Honda City range is even more extreme. The full active driving suite, sportier looks, and even a completely different hybrid powertrain that's all reserved for the top variant only. So we'll see how Malaysian car buyers react to that product strategy. From the outside, I do have to mention that the X50 looks really small. Well, it's not quite a Myvi SUV as some people have said it. It's a little bit bigger than that, but visually it does look a lot smaller than the Honda HR-V. In person, you wouldn't have guessed that this car's dimensions is actually almost a match to the HR-V, and in fact, this is actually wider and taller than the Honda. This visual trick of making this car look a lot smaller than it actually is well both good and bad. The good thing is it makes this car look really sporty. So those of you who think that SUVs are always a little bit too uncle, too feminine, this one is neither one of those. But on the other hand, this car's compact looks does mean that it does not have much of a visual presence on the road, especially compared to its bigger brother, the X70. I remember 2 years ago seeing the X70 for the first time, and that looked really impressive, very premium, very stately. And that's not something you can say about this one. This car looks so small, it's a little bit underwhelming when you see it for the first time. Like, is that it? So small one. Still, in terms of styling, the X50 makes the X70 look a couple of years older immediately. While the X70 was all big and round, this X50 is all sharp lines and deep cuts. Now, I said Geely and not Proton because obviously this is all Geely's design. All Proton has done, like the X70, is just change the front grille, which I think is a bit disappointing. Now, I'm not saying that this car doesn't look good, because I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And I'm not saying that the Proton grille is ugly either, because if anything, I think it looks even better than the original Geely design. My issue is that Proton Design has told us repeatedly over the past 2 years that it's going to get more and more active in its role of adding Malaysian flavors to Geely design. But when it all comes out, all we see is a new grille. So yeah, I think that's disappointing. But if you put Malaysian pride aside, I think this really is a gorgeous looking car, especially from the front. It's very sporty, it's very modern, it's very fashionable all at the same time. And overall, this is a very striking design that I think will stand the test of time quite well. I especially like the chrome bits at the end of the headlights and the wing mirrors that are inspired by the ends of plain wings. I think that is a nice touch. It's also worth noting that we are getting the sportier set of bumpers as standard here in Malaysia. See, the Geely Binua in China comes with two different looks. There's a plainer, more conservative design for the cheaper variants and a sportier set of bumpers for the more expensive variants. Here in Malaysia, Proton has used the more sporty set across the board for the X50. Another upgrade compared to the cars in China is the headlamps. In China, the base models get very basic halogen headlamps, but over here, even the cheapest version gets full LED headlights with LED daytime running lights. The DRLs also double up as your turning indicators, which is really cool. Moving on to the side, the premium flagship models get these dual-tone 18-inch wheels together with red-painted brake calipers all around. They also get Continental UC6 tyres, which is a pretty good rubber, but be warned, this will cost over 400 ringgit per corner to replace, so be prepared for that. Down here is what I think is the most interesting design feature on the X50, this curved line that tapers neatly into the doors. This is inspired by the silhouette of a tiger leaping forward, giving this car a more athletic side view. It's also a good coincidence for Proton because of course it has a tiger on the front logo. One thing that I find annoying on the X50 is the lack of a keyless entry sensor on the rear door handles. So if you want to put something on the back of the car before you start driving, you have to first unlock the car through the front door handles, which is a little bit annoying. But I guess this is a common issue across a lot of cars of this size and perhaps even bigger. And at the very least, the Proton has a more advanced touch system compared to buttons on the HR-V. But still, it would be nice to have, wouldn't it? Around the back, a lot of people have commented that the back doesn't quite match the aggressive front end of this car. And here, I have to agree with them. It doesn't look ugly per se, but I think it just looks a bit too plain, a bit too boring compared to the front end. Still, it has a few nice design details such as this big satin chrome bar that extends through into the taillights, and the LED lights themselves have this really cool wing effect at night that's properly classy there. I gotta say though, the lights are not fully LED units just yet because the turn signals still use regular old bulbs. That's a bit of a bummer. Now, this may be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I like the fact that Proton has actually toned down the look of this car compared to the Geely base car. In other markets, there's actually a much bigger double-layer spoiler with a big S on the side, but we don't get that here. Proton has decided to keep this smaller, more subtle-looking rear wing, which I really like. Another thing that we miss out on are the carbon fiber print wing mirror covers that are available in other markets. To me, that's not a big loss because I think I prefer the more subtle look with the X50 that we get over here. And this car already has too many carbon fiber print across the entire lower lip of the car anyway. But then again, having seen what the people in the owners group are saying, I might be alone in this one. What is more universally liked are the quad tailpipe design down here. Now, these are real actual pipes, as in each one of the 4 pipes are actually connected to the exhaust system. Now, this is a refreshing change of pace compared to what we've seen lately with Mercedes-Benz AMGs, the Volkswagens, and even the Proton Perdana. Now, before we get into the car, I want to show you a cool feature on the X50, which is remote engine start. You can actually start the car's engine using just the key fob itself. All you have to do is press the lock button and then the bottom button, hold it there for a couple of seconds, and the engine will start over there. There you go. There's a sequence of button presses that's been called over here because they don't want you to accidentally start the car up with the key in your pocket, so they've really thought about it. Now you want to use this feature because by doing this, the aircon system in the car also turns on, so by the time you get into the car, it'll be nice and cool. To use this feature with a key fob, you have to be of a certain close proximity with the car, but you can also use the Proton Link app on your smartphone, and with that you can even start the car up from wherever you are. You can be overseas and then start the car up to, to not let the engine die even when you're out and away for a couple of weeks. Well, that's as and when we can travel again, of course. One cool safety feature is that there is a time limit for the engine to be on, which is a maximum of 10 minutes. Now this is set to cut off the risk of you forgetting about it and leaving the engine on for hours and hours until the engine runs out of fuel. Now that is something that a lot of the aftermarket systems suffer from. One more thing, while the engine is on, the car is still completely locked, so no one can just come in and drive off with your car. Inside a Proton X50, it's a wild mix of really good and at the same time really bad as well. But I'll start with the good stuff, which is design and quality. In here you do get a feel of classiness that you don't get in any of this car's Japanese rivals, especially the Honda HR-V. This feels like a class or two above. In terms of materials, the entire top half is built of very nice feeling soft materials, and I really do like this dark maroon shade of red for the top of the dashboard. I think Proton is being really daring and bold here in offering a two-tone dashboard look, but I really applaud them for it. It makes the car look and feel a lot more interesting, a lot more premium, I would say. The one worry of having a bright colored dashboard is the issue of having the dashboard reflect on the windscreen. But on this car, I have yet to see any sort of reflections on the windscreen, so yeah, there's absolutely no worry of that. As you move down the cabin, the plastics do gradually get harder and rougher, but that is to be expected in this class. This is still a B segment vehicle after all, but at no point does this car feel absolutely cheap or nasty. Well, except one part, which is actually a major issue for me. The front door handles, they just don't feel like it's gonna last very long. It feels like at some point it's going to snap. And for them to use such cheap plastics on a major touch point that you're gonna use day in and day out, that is a major fault, Proton, come on. The gear lever also gives off a semi-premium vibe because this is similar to what you'd find in a BMW, for instance. This is an electronic gear lever that no matter what you do to it, it always comes back down to the center. Now this of course is the exact same gear lever we've seen in the CKD X70, but this year it looks a lot more cohesive with the rest of the design because this was designed from the get-go with this gear lever in mind, whereas the X70 was just something a bit like an afterthought. In terms of practicality, this dashboard design really doesn't do all that well. In front here, there's a small little tray to put your handphones or your cards or your wallet or whatnot. It feels like you are quite limited in terms of cubby spaces in this car. Well, there's this small little hole down here, but accessing it is a bit of a stretch, so I don't understand why they have it there in the first place. It's not quite as practical as the floating dash designs in Volvos, for instance. Now moving further back, there's this tiny slot over here which I don't quite understand. It looks like it should fit regular size cards, but yeah, it's just that tiny bit too short for regular cards. There is another set of card holders on the right side of the driver, which is a nice touch. Under the center armrest is a really tiny box again, but down there is a small print of the car's key. That is where you're supposed to put your car key in case your car key's battery runs low, and if you put it down there at the printout, it should be able to read the key for you to start the car. Speaking of the key itself, I think it does look really good. It has a bit of a premium feel to it, although considering its size, it does feel a little bit light in your hands. But then again, this is a much nicer key than a comparable Honda. Now in terms of equipment levels, this car pretty much has everything. This is more or less the highest spec version of the Geely Binue available in other markets, except for a few omissions such as paddle shifters ambient lighting on instrument cluster and the dashboard, as well as an integrated dash cam behind the rear view mirror. But yeah, if you compare this car against cars that are available in Malaysia, nothing else even comes close. Moving on to the seats, Proton calls this leatherette, even though I think this time Proton is being a little bit too honest for his own good. By calling it leatherette, people are complaining to Proton that they are not using actual leather on their cars. I mean, come on. Very few car brands use actual leather on any of their cars. I mean, Mercedes uses Artico leather, that's artificial leather, on even the E-Class and the S-Class. So yeah, Proton using artificial leather here is not a big deal. It's nowhere near as nice as the Napa leather in the X70 Premium, obviously. It's definitely better than a lot of the seats in this class and in this price range. The seats themselves are not very good, I'm afraid. They certainly look very good, especially with this dark red and black motif. But in terms of support, they are, I would say, severely lacking in this department. You know, I'm not very tall. I'm only 167 centimeters tall, and even for me, the seat base is a little bit too short. So yeah, I think over long journeys, this can make you feel very, very tired. Another major issue here that I think stems from the conversion from left-hand drive to right-hand drive is the lack of adjustability of the right-hand side mirror. Even at its widest position, the view angle is still too narrow to give a good view out over the blind spots over here. For me, because I sit up close to the steering wheel, it's not that big of a problem for me. But I can see that for taller drivers who sit slightly further back, that is a major issue. I hope Proton can fix this as soon as they can. Now, before all you Proton fanboys come at me with pitchforks, I actually do like certain parts of this car's cabin. This instrument cluster over here really hits the mark, and I think it really fits the futuristic look and feel of this car overall. This is a fully digital instrument cluster, and it has three very distinct looking appearance themes that are paired with the three drive modes of normal, eco and sport. Each one looks very different, especially sport, and the best part is you can actually customize the screen to keep to your favorite theme even without having you to force on the driving mode. Like, say for instance, I like the look of the eco meter, but I don't want to drive in eco mode all the time, so I can just set it through the screen. I really like that level of customization that's available to you. Now, flanking the center screen are two very big dials. On the left is a massive temperature gauge, so those of you who are always complaining that certain cars, you know, from the other brand does not have a temperature gauge, there you go, that's a massive one for you. On the right side is a fuel gauge, which also is a bit oversized in my opinion. This is not an actual analog gauge. It runs by bars, and since the bars are so big, it looks a little bit alarming when an entire bar goes off and you think that the car is guzzling fuel. But in actuality, this car's fuel consumption really isn't that bad, which I'll mention when I drive the car later. This has a fully electric sunshade and sunroof setup, and of course there is a one-touch control to it. The sunshade itself actually does a very good job of blocking the sun when you're driving in the middle of the day, but it doesn't quite block enough of the heat coming through the sunroof, so you are going to have to tint the sunroof for obviously extra cost. Now let's talk about the big center screen over here with the fancy GKUI 19 interface. Now, the interface itself does look very good, and the response time is actually quite nice. It's all very snappy, the reaction is quite quick, but actually I don't really have much nice things to say about it. The much publicized high Proton voice recognition system works really well, even better than it did in the X70 obviously, but ultimately it's not going to be something that's proven useful in the long run. You'll use it once or twice to show off to your friends, and that's about it. I mean, no one is actually going to use phrases like, I want to see the stars, or I want to see the sky, or please open the windows, or please, I don't know, play Britney Spears or whatever. No one's...
Hey, window has been opened for you.
Thank you. No one's actually going to use that in the long run. Still on this, the biggest issue I have with this system is the lack of an Apple CarPlay or Android Auto connection. Instead, there is a QD Link app, which is basically a mirror link function for your iPhones and Android, but the functionality here is absolutely garbage for iPhones. It's absolutely useless. Don't bother with it at all. For Android, it's not actually too bad. You can actually control some phone functions through the screen. But compared to a proper integration of Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, this is a very, very poor alternative. In Proton's defense, there are full functionalities of all the apps that you would want to use on this system, like navigation and audio. But instead of using apps such as Google Maps, Waze, or Spotify, this screen over here forces you to use other unknown weird apps such as its AMAP navigation and Jukes music. Yeah, no. It's like forcing you to change from drinking Milo to drinking hot chocolate every day. I'm sorry, I'm gonna stick to what I know and love. Thank you very much. And I'm not even done yet with this screen. This car does have a full 360-degree camera, but it looks like you're watching a 3GP video. It is that blurry. Now, compared to some of the cars in this price range, it's not actually that bad. I've seen worse, much worse really, like say Toyota Hilux. But at the same time, we've seen one of the best systems in the entire industry fitted to the Proton X50. So I don't understand why there is such a big downgrade to this car. This isn't that much cheaper than the X70 anyway. Now, on to my last complaint on the screen. It's the last one, I promise. It may look like this car has a dual zone climate control system with temperature controls on each side, but actually if you move one, the other side moves with you. So this is actually a single zone climate control system. It just looks like a fake dual zone system. So yeah, there's that. You wanted me to be detailed, that's detailed for you. Now let's go back to the rear seats. As you can see, there's absolutely nothing to worry about in terms of space. It's really quite spacious back here. As we've shown before, even a person as tall as 6 feet can sit behind himself in this car with no space issues whatsoever. Now, this might not be quite as spacious as the Honda HR-V, but I think in the back here, the seats are slightly more comfortable and I think it's slightly wider as well. You will still struggle to fit 3 adults in the back bench over here, but that's the same story with pretty much the entire B-segment SUV class as well. But at least you have a rather flat floor in the back here. One major upgrade that the X50 has over its base Geely car is the rear aircon vents. Now, this has been fitted exclusively for the Malaysian market because, you know, our special weather. Other amenities include small little hooks in the back here, as well as here for your jackets or small tapao food items, as well as individual reading LED lights. That's quite a nice thing in this class. Although I have to mention that the door cards in the back here are all hard compared to the soft ones in front. There is a stark difference between the two. That's not quite such a nice thing to see. Before we move on to the boot, there's one small little flaw that I want to highlight for the rear seats. First of all, the rear doors don't really open as wide as they really should, and the door aperture here is actually quite narrow. There's this bit of plastic sticking out, so getting in and out is not as easy as what is ideal. As for the boot, the X50 starts off on the wrong foot because there's no proper grab handle to lift up the tailgate. There's just this small little lip by the boot release button for you to lift this rather heavy tailgate. I mean, come on, how hard would it have been to design a proper recess for this? This really wouldn't be an issue at all if you opt for the optional powered tailgate feature, but I do have a few issues with that too. First of all, that really should have been included together with the flagship model. And then there's the price of it. The power tailgate over here is only available in packages. Both packages bundle in a bunch of useless things that you don't want, such as this really ugly quilted PVC mat, or even magnetic sunshades instead of things you want like window tints. On the bright side, you can actually put that 3,000 ringgit into your car loan, but really that's quite a lot of money for essentially just the electric tailgate feature. There are a lot more affordable aftermarket options out there obviously, but doing so will void your warranty. Plug and play or not, it's going to void your warranty, trust me. Proton has confirmed this with me, so unfortunately the only way to get power tailgate on your X50 without affecting your warranty is to get it through this expensive packages. I don't like it either, but that's just the way it is now. As for the boot itself, this is definitely on the smaller side of things with just 330 liters of space. That's actually the smallest in the entire class, smaller even than the Mazda CX-3 and Hyundai Kona, both of which are not known for their practicality either. Just for a comparison, the Honda HR-V has a 515 liter boot space. That's over 55% bigger than this one. That is a massive difference. But then again, I really don't think it's that bad back here. I think the load lip is quite low and the aperture is rather wide. You can easily fit in a few large suitcases in here, no problem. I've even seen a few owners putting in a large golf bag in the back here. For bigger items, of course, you can fold down the rear seats, although they do it with a slight angle, less than ideal. Overall, I think it's a usable boot. Bigger would have been better, obviously, but it's still not a deal breaker for me. What I really hate is the lack of any usable hooks in the back here. So if you got any shopping bags or plastic bags, they'll be rolling around in the entire boot as you drive around. Plus, for whatever reason, Proton has also taken out the small little nettings that's available in other markets. And now that would have been useful for smaller items, but yeah, they're not here. Such a pity. Now, underneath the boot floor is a Silun Space Saver spare tire. Now, I got a lot of flack in my previous video because I've said I've never heard of that brand, but I'm sorry, when it comes to tires, I only look at name brands. On a car, that's one of the last things I want to try to save some money on, so yeah, forgive me for that. For now, let's go drive this thing finally. So finally, we're driving the new Proton X50 on proper Malaysian roads. This is our first taster of what the X50 is like in the real world. Let's talk about the engine first. The X50 has two engines, but they both run very similar configurations of a 1.5 litre 3-cylinder turbocharged engine. The cheaper 3 versions, the standard, executive and premium, all get an MPI version of that engine, whereas this flagship version gets a more advanced TGDI direct injection version of the same engine. The power outputs are a little bit different. The MPI engine gets 150 PS and 226 Newton meters of torque, whereas the full-fat TGDI version makes 177 PS and 255 Newton meters of torque. That is a fair upgrade both in terms of power and torque. But having spoken to a few people who have driven both cars, I've been told that there isn't much of a significant difference between the two engines at all. But I'll wait and see until I get to drive the MPI engines to give my full comment. So for this review, I'll be focusing more on the TGDI engine in this flagship variant. All X50 variants get the same 7-speed wet dual clutch transmission, the same one that we've seen in the CKD X70 before. Both the engine and transmission are co-developed between Geely and Volvo. Geely, of course, owns 100% of Volvo. Just as a gauge of durability, Volvo and Geely says that this engine has been used in over 600,000 units of cars, whereas the gearbox has been used in over 1 million units of cars across the globe. That's in Volvo's, Geely's, Lick & Co.'s, and of course now Proton. Now, both the engine and transmission are a little bit controversial in Malaysia, but let's talk about the engine first. The controversial bit about the engine is the fact that it is a 3-cylinder unit instead of the more mainstream 4-cylinder orientation. Now, the stigma around 3-cylinder engines is of course that it's very unrefined, that it vibrates a lot, and I think anybody who has driven a 3-cylinder Perodua, the Viva, the Azia, and perhaps the Kanchil before that will know what I'm talking about. But I'll talk about the basics first. There are actual reasons why 4-cylinder engines are much more refined than typical 3-cylinder engines, and that's all about physics. Now you see, with 4 cylinders you can sort of cancel the forces of the cylinders out. You can have 2 cylinders go up and 2 cylinders go down, and the forces of them will cancel each other out. The engine will remain level. With 3-cylinder engines, you can't really balance things out. You can have 2 up and 1 down, or maybe perhaps different variations of timing. But either way, 3-cylinder engines are inherently imbalanced. That's why it's known to have such heavy vibrations and really bad refinement. But that's when we're talking about regular 3-cylinder engines. This one over here is built to a much higher standards. Again, co-developed by Volvo. Volvo, remember, has always been the odd player out in the European markets. When everybody was using 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder engines, Volvo was out alone playing with 5-cylinder turbo engines for the longest time. So they've had long history of managing vibrations coming from an odd-cylindered engine. So when it comes to developing a 3-cylinder engine, Volvo was ahead of the game. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the technical stuff that they've put into the engine to sort of minimize the imbalance, to minimize the vibrations of this engine. I'm just going to talk about what it actually feels on the road. Now, Volvo and Geely claim that they have come to a point where this 3-cylinder engine feels just as refined as a traditional 4-cylinder engine. And for the most part, I would have to agree with them. When you're driving normally, when you're accelerating up and down the gears, or even when you are completely stopped and idling, you do not feel anything coming from the engine. But I would be lying to say that this does not feel like a 3-cylinder engine at all, because there are key moments where this is obviously a 3-cylinder engine versus a 4-cylinder engine. Number one is when you are starting the engine, especially at cold startups in the morning. The engine comes to life with a bit of a vibration that you certainly feel through the seats, through the pedals, through the steering wheel, and it will quickly even out as the engine heats up. But that's something that you will feel pretty much every morning, really. And then at very low throttle applications, when you're accelerating slowly between 1000 to 2000 RPM, there is a slight vibration coming through the pedals. Now, all these things you would only notice if you are looking for any sort of vibrations or faults in the car, of course. I think if you're living with the car day in and day out, you'll quickly forget about it. Now, a quick note on the engine noise. Just listen to it. I think it sounds great. It even sounds better than most 4-cylinder engines out there. It does not sound like a rattly 3-cylinder Proton engine at all, don't you agree? So yeah, overall I think the engine is a fantastic one. I think the only real complaint I have of the engine is that the engine cover looks really boring, especially compared to what Geely gets. It's almost like the Proton designers have completely given up. I don't get it, guys. Another so-called controversial detail is the fact that this car runs a timing belt system instead of a chain drive. Now, this is only an issue here in Malaysia, where people have formed camps, the timing belt camp and the chain drive camp. And yeah, nowhere else in the world is this an issue at all. So with this car, there is a timing belt system, and you do have to change it around every 110,000 kilometers, or about 5.5 years or something like that. And the cost to change all that is about 400 ringgit. I think 400 bucks every 5 years for a car costing 100,000 ringgit. That is not a big deal at all. Now let's move on to the gearbox. This is a 7-speed dual clutch transmission, and specifically to Malaysia again, dual clutch transmissions have developed a rather bad and unreliable reputation, especially with the early DSG Volkswagens as well as the Ford power shifts. But you do have to remember that most of those failures had been the dry clutch version of the dual clutch transmission. The wet type versions have been far more reliable and durable, and thankfully the one that's fitted here is a wet type dual clutch transmission. Just like the engine, it's also co-developed between Volvo and Geely, and because of that, it has had to go through extensive durability and reliability testings and standards. So Volvo claims that it runs its engines and transmission to a much higher standard compared to the industry standards. Everything needs to have a service life of over 350,000 kilometers, which is a little bit higher than the industry standard of just 240,000 kilometers. So yeah, in terms of reliability, I think Volvo and Geely, I think they know what they're doing. Now, as to why they've chosen a DCT instead of a CVT or a automatic transmission, it's all in the name of efficiency. Geely and Volvo says that with this dual clutch transmission, they have achieved one of the highest standards of efficiency in the industry. This gearbox is claimed to have a power efficiency of up to 97%. This is much higher than what can be achieved with a traditional automatic gearbox. Geely says that a traditional AT can go up to about 90%. In terms of efficiency, 3-cylinder engines are supposed to be a fair bit more efficient compared to 4-cylinder engines, and of course they also have a lot less moving parts, there's less things to go wrong, and of course they are slightly cheaper to manufacture in the first place. So the next time anybody asks why Proton and Geely is using a 3-cylinder engine and a DCT, now you know. It's also worth noting that this car is built on Geely's own BMA platform. This is not a Volvo platform like in the XC40. The XC40 runs a much more advanced Volvo CMA platform. This is a cheaper, simpler version that is developed by Geely, not Volvo. So yeah, it's not quite a budget Volvo, guys. But enough of all the boring technical talk. How does it actually feel out on the road? I'll tell you what, this engine is fantastic. It's not just about raw power, although this engine has that in loads as well. It's just how tractable, how easy to use this car feels. It feels very effortless in a way that no naturally aspirated engine can match. With this car, you get a boot full of torque very low down the revs, so you don't have to rev the engine high up at all. You just get a very powerful and constant surge forward, and the transmission also works very well together with the engine. It all feels very, very well sought out. Now, Proton claims that this car does 0 to 100 in about 7.9 seconds. Now, I've timed this car myself and I failed to do 7.9 seconds. I've done around 8.5 to 8.7 seconds depending on the road and the weather conditions or whatnot. But I think that's close enough to the actual official claims. It's certainly not quite as slow as what we've seen when we tested it in Sepang the previous time. It's not a 10-second car, it's more of an 8.5-second car. In that sense, the difference between this and its closest rival, the Honda HR-V, is absolutely massive. Let's just talk about the numbers here. This car, obviously being turbocharged, has much higher power and torque compared to the HR-V. But more importantly, it's when the peak torque is delivered. This car gets its maximum torque at just over 1,500 RPM, and it holds all that to over 4,000 RPM. The Honda HR-V, meanwhile, runs a naturally aspirated 1.8 litre engine, and that only makes 172 Newton meters of torque. But more crucially, that's only developed at 4,300 RPM. By the time the HR-V reaches its peak torque figure, the X50 would have been miles ahead because it's been riding its peak torque from pretty much idle, basically. In terms of performance, it's a night and day difference. I've always mentioned that once you've experienced a turbo car, it's really hard to go back to a naturally aspirated car. And I think if you've driven this car back to back with the HR-V, you would completely agree with me. Now, but that's also a different saying that once you go turbo, your wallet's gonna blow. That, of course, is in terms of fuel efficiency, but it really isn't as bad as that. I've had this car for about a week now, and I've done about 500 kilometers, and over that, I've averaged about 8.5 to 9 liters per 100 kilometers, and over a full tank of 45 liters, I managed to get just about 500 kilometers. That's not too bad really. And just as a simple comparison with my own personal car, a Mercedes-Benz C-Class Coupe that has a 1.5 litre 4-cylinder engine, and through the same roads, I usually average about 9.5 to 10 litres per 100 kilometer. Of course, it's a whole different car, different weights and whatnot, but yeah, you can sort of see how a 3-cylinder engine will save you a little bit of fuel in the long run. Now let's talk about how the DCT feels, the dual clutch transmission. Just like on the CKD X70, it doesn't feel like a dual clutch transmission at all. It feels much more like a traditional automatic torque converter transmission really, to be honest. With the regular DCTs in other car brands such as Volkswagen, Hyundai and even Mercedes-Benz, they usually have a similar characteristic, which is rough from takeoff and then quick and ultra smooth gear shifts through the gears as you accelerate. This one, it's sort of almost the complete polar opposite. It has an extremely smooth creep function, and accelerating from a standstill is very smooth. You would not think that this is a DCT at all if you didn't know it to begin with. But as you accelerate through the gears, you will feel the gear changes is nowhere near as seamless as the ones in other DCT gearboxes. This car, there will be a slight pause between each gear changes, again like a regular, slightly old school automatic transmission. I think that has been engineered in to sort of guarantee its reliability, and if that is actually the reason, I'm all for it. But in terms of the gearbox response, it's actually pretty good. As soon as you jab the throttle, the engine climbs up as it drops down a couple of gears, and everything is done very, very smooth, very quickly. This car also has 3 very distinct feeling driving modes. Normal is of course where you would normally drive the car in, but you also have Eco, which is a little bit extreme in the way it dulls down your throttle response. It almost feels like the car has gone lethargic. I'm thinking of a much harsher word, but yeah, I probably shouldn't say it. But the car will feel like it's refusing to react to your inputs. So yeah, I think to me, Eco mode is a complete bust. I'm never ever going to use it. It's the same with Sport mode as well. I think that's only ever going to be used on the track, which this car is not really the kind that's built for that either. In Sport mode, everything is just too jerky, too jumpy. As soon as you touch the throttle, the car jumps down and it leaps forward. It cannot be used for normal driving. So yeah, I think there has to be some sort of fine-tuning that can be done with the driving modes. They are both a little bit too extreme now, and you're much better off just leaving it in normal and be done with it. Now let's talk about ride and handling. Now this isn't really a Proton at all, much like the X70 was not really a Proton to begin with. This is a Geely product. And Proton has just been given a little bit of a leeway to sort of retune the suspension to suit Malaysian roads more. But with the X50, they've actually done a fair bit more than they did with the X70. This feels a lot more like a traditional true blue Proton car to drive. The suspension especially is very well sorted. It feels almost as sophisticated as a European car. It feels a lot more controlled than, say, a typical Japanese car in the way it absorbs bumps even when you're going slow or fast or anything in between. And through corners, it's absolutely beautiful. Now this stands in stark contrast against the original Geely Binyue. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to has driven the car has said that that car is almost unnaturally stiff. That car is only usable in China and not anywhere else. Thankfully, Geely has had enough faith for Proton to completely change the driving characteristics of this car. You can still feel the inherent firmness in the suspension settings, but that's not a bad thing at all. Proton has really worked its magic and its technical know-how in terms of making this car ride and handle beautifully through Malaysian roads. The only thing that is not quite as good is the steering wheel. I think Proton couldn't really do much with that. Again, like the transmission, there are 3 modes for the steering wheel. There's Eco, there's Normal and Sport. And the only thing that changes is the weight of the steering wheel. You don't get any extra feel through it at all. So for me, I've left it purely in Normal. I think Eco is too light, and again, Sport is just too heavy for pretty much no benefit really. And thankfully enough, just like the instrument cluster, you can also detach the steering setting away from the gearbox settings, the drive modes. So if for whatever reason you want to drive the car in Sport mode but have the steering in Eco mode, yeah, good on you, you can do that. So as a driving tool, this is a very, very competent machine, and if the mood comes in, it can deliver some fun as well. In that sense, it's a far better balance than the X70. But that dynamism also comes at the expense of a little bit of comfort. In the X70, that car is pretty much fully tuned for comfort and nothing else on the road. Moving from a Honda CR-V to a Proton X70, purely in terms of ride comfort, it can feel like you're going up 2-3 classes up. With this one, it doesn't quite feel like 2 classes up compared to a HR-V. It is still a class above, obviously, but the margin here isn't quite as big. If there's one thing that really spoils the driving experience of this car, it's the refinement, or rather the lack of. The biggest issue is in wind noise, where as soon as you hit 80 kilometers per hour, 100 kilometers per hour, or God forbid 120 kilometers per hour, there is a really significant wind rustling coming around from the A-pillars and the wing mirrors. I haven't really experienced something this bad in a modern car for as long as I can remember. I think there's something that's seriously wrong with this. I've been told that Proton is aware of the problem and they are looking for ways to fix this issue. So yeah, we'll see what they can do with this problem. I just hope that if they do find a solution, they wouldn't forget the existing car owners out on the road already. I hope they can roll out proper updates for cars that are already on the road. Yeah, fingers crossed for that. Now, there are of course a lot of blind supporters that say, yeah, you're just complaining out of nothing. The wind noise isn't really that bad. But trust me, it is. It's even worse because the rest of this car's refinement levels are actually excellent. You know what? If this car had louder engine noise and louder tire roar and whatnot, this wind issue would be much less of a problem overall. It's only because everything else on the car is completely hushed that's all you can hear as you drive along. So yeah, Proton, in a way, by making the rest of the car better, has made this issue even worse. Yeah, this really annoys me. I can't understand how Proton claims to have done so many thousands and hours of test driving here in Malaysia and none of them picked up on this issue. I can't brain that at all. So from the absolute lowest point of the car to the absolute best, the level 2 semi-autonomous driving features on the X50. This car has far more advanced feature set even compared to its bigger, more expensive brother, the X70. The X70, Proton says, has a level 1 autonomous driving feature, which is just adaptive cruise control. This one takes it up a level further. This has intelligent cruise control, which is basically a semi-autonomous driving feature. Now, Proton has been the only car brand in Malaysia to use the term level 2 semi-autonomous driving. But in actual fact, that's not something new or something unique to Proton alone. Similar systems from Honda and Toyota, the Honda Sensing, the Toyota Safety Sense, those are pretty much all level 2 systems as well. As long as you have a system that controls both the pedals and the steering wheel at the same time, you can consider it a level 2 system. So as long as you have adaptive cruise control and active lane keep assist, that's level 2 semi-autonomous driving. So yeah, it's not something that's completely out there, something completely unique to Proton, but it is unique to this price range, because remember, this is barely above 100,000 ringgit. Pretty much everything else with the same feature set are priced much higher. Not even too long ago, this was reserved for cars costing more than 500,000 ringgit and above, like the S-Class and the 7 Series and whatnot. Now you can have it in a Proton for 100,000 ringgit. That is brilliant. Now let's talk about how it all works. The intelligent cruise control system uses two things: a camera up on the windscreen up here, as well as a millimeter wave radar on the bottom of the front bumper. So the radar and the camera works together to sort of like sense and scan the road ahead, scanning for cars, scanning for bikes, scanning for pedestrians, and of course scanning for road lines. So with all that data, the car will then drive itself almost to keep it in lane, keep it away from other cars, keep a safe distance from other cars, and brake if necessary. The best thing about this is that all the inputs are very linear. So this is quite an advanced version of intelligent cruise control here. It's not like in older systems where all the inputs were done in a very ragged, very rough manner. This has a proper lane centering system. So while the cameras and the radar tracks the actual road markers, the steering will move itself to position the car right smack in the middle of the road. You're not bouncing off road markers over here, you are actually following the road lanes. It's obviously not quite as advanced as the ones in the newer Volvos and whatnot. It's probably about a half a generation behind, but it's about on par with what's available on the Hondas and Toyotas. Yeah, and this being cheaper, come on, that's such a good deal. This also has something called traffic jam assist, which means it can drive itself, technically I mean, through traffic jams. So all you have to do is press a button, set everything up, and then it will maintain a set distance to the car in front in stop and go traffic situations. You can actually set this car to follow the car in front at a rather close distance. And usually with a lot of other systems in Hondas and whatnot, the cars will give too big of a gap in front of you. And Malaysian drivers being Malaysian drivers, there's always going to be a Kanchil or a Myvi that's going to get into that gap. With this one, I don't know whether Proton has programmed the gap to be smaller to fit Malaysian driving, characteristics. There's very small gap in front of the car, and as soon as the car ahead jumps forward, this car will follow. And yeah, it's a very seamless experience, and it's quite a nice thing to have, especially at this price range. One thing to note though, that this clearly isn't a proper autopilot system. This is not like a Tesla advanced self-drive kind of thing. You are still required to pay full attention on the road. You are still required to have your hands on the steering at all times. In fact, as soon as you lift off your steering wheel and leave it for like 1 or 2 seconds, the car will detect that you're not putting any torque on the steering wheel and ask that you please drive the car again. The car will actually know that you're not paying attention. It's the same with the traffic jam assist as well. So there you go. That's all car, that's not me. And it's actually stopping in a rather linear manner. It's not a sudden braking movement. That's all the car, that's not me at all. With traffic jam assist, with stop and go traffic situations, the car has a buffer of around 3 seconds, where if the car is stationary for anything less than 3 seconds, it will continue driving following the car in front. But as soon as the car is completely stationary for more than 3 seconds, you will then have to manually tap the accelerator to get the car moving again. This is more of a safety feature, just to make sure that you are still in control, that you are still paying attention to driving. It doesn't want you to feel like the car is taking over all control, so you are free to do whatever you want, like be on the phone, go on Facebook and whatnot. Volvos have the exact same safety feature set. Like as you can see over here, the car forward has moved up, the car's not moving. I'm just tapping the accelerator, and yeah, the car now is following the X70 in front. That is pretty cool, isn't it? Now here's something like an Easter egg which I find absolutely hilarious. When you're driving around with your intelligent cruise control on, the screen in front of you will show you where the lines are, if there's any cars in front of you, on the side of you. The display actually gives you a lot of confidence that this car is actually scanning the road to drive for you. But what I find the most amusing is that every time you accelerate, the car inside the screen will have like an afterburner on the exhaust pipes. That is absolutely hilarious. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the bad parts of this car's ADAS systems, because obviously, as you've seen throughout this whole video, with all the good things, there are the bad things as well. This car isn't really quite as perfect as it really should be. So this here, we are in a traffic jam situation where this car's traffic jam assist is helping me drive the car. So it is maintaining the distance to the car in front, but in doing so, every single time the car is braking, there is a bit of a clicking sound coming from the brake pedal. Listen up. That, did you hear that? That comes in every single time. And when you're in a traffic jam, that happens over and over and over. Okay, listen. Yeah, how annoying is that? Come on. Again. Yeah. I don't get how you can be driving thousands of hours on Malaysian roads and not see this feature. Come on, Proton. We expect better. Besides that, there is also this small other issue that I sort of found by accident. Well, basically, when you come to a stop and you have your auto hold function on, like now, coming to a complete stop. Yeah. Now I should explain that this car has a pretty good auto hold system. Unlike other systems in Hondas and even BMWs, as soon as the car comes to a complete stop, the auto hold function grabs the brakes. This car doesn't do that. This car requires you to come to a stop and then sort of press the brake pedal a little bit further. So it's sort of like an auto hold on demand kind of system. My Mercedes has a similar system, and it's one of the best things I like about that car and now this car. But here's what happens when you're at a complete stop and your auto hold is on. You can press the brakes, and when you lift the brakes, there's this weird sound. What is that? Come on, man. That does not give you confidence at all. Proton, if you watch this, please get a fix for this. So that's our full review of the Proton X50. Like I said at the start, this car has a long list of faults and flaws. So those who are looking to buy one, do so with your eyes wide open. Know what you're getting into. But ultimately, is this car good enough for me to recommend it to everyone? The answer has to be a definite yes. Despite this car's minor niggles all around, it's still an extremely good car all around. It's quick, it's comfortable, it's very good to drive, and it's even actually quite spacious inside. But more than anything else, there's just nothing else that comes even close to the level of value that this car offers in the market today. The only car that offers the same amount of power and tech in the market today is the Hyundai Kona, but that is priced at over 40,000 ringgit more than this one. And then there's the Honda City with similar amount of tech on the RS, but this being an SUV, a lot of people will think that this is a step up compared to the City for around the same amount of money. In many ways, the X50 is every bit as good as it promised to be. And for me, none of its minor niggles are anywhere near big enough to be deal breakers. So for myself, do I regret booking one? Not a chance. Now I can't wait to get my own unit. Let me put it this way. Doing what I do, testing new cars week in and week out, I usually feel glad to go back to my own car, Mercedes-Benz C-Class Coupe, at the end of each test drive. But it's not the same story with this one. I actually like this car so much that I'm actually thinking of making it my primary daily car in place of the Mercedes. I'll see what happens when I finally get the car eventually, but for now I think there is a good chance of that happening. I'll do more videos of my X50 when I do get it, but for now, what do you think of the X50 and my review of it? If there's anything that you disagree with, do let me know in the comments section below. For now, thank you for watching and stay safe everyone.